Hello. You'd think that since I scheduled these live views or these live streams that I would be all prepared, but no, I scheduled these right after lunch. So I'm like frantically trying to finish up my drink here. So don't mind me. Welcome. My name is Laura Forsick. I'm the executive director of space consulting firm Astrolytical, about 20 years in the space sector. Really excited to talk to you about another space policy topic, which is my geekery. My background is in astronomy, astrophysics, and planetary science and the commercial space sector, but I really love space policy. So you might have noticed last week's theme. Yeah, forgive me. I actually put my phone in my cleavage because we don't have pockets. This is me frantically trying to do things right before the live stream starts. Um, we need pockets for our dresses, ladies. Anyway, so last week's topic had to do more with the Artemis Accords, and I went into some detail about the gateway, the space station that's going to be orbiting around the moon. I'm not going to go into that super detailed, but I am going to mention it today. If you're curious about what I discussed last week, you can watch the live stream from last week. But today's topic is more about the Chinese grouping of countries that are looking to go back to the moon, or I should say go to the moon for the first time with China leadership. And then the US and the US going back to the moon with international partnerships and US leadership. And this is a really cool topic because I feel like it is usually discussed in really simplistic terms, the new space race. And no, I mean, like, some people will definitely disagree with me and say, of course, it's a space race, but I don't believe so. I believe it's a competition. And I believe there's a lot of nuances that are just ignored. And so I want to discuss a little bit of this today, especially in light of the fact that the Artemis Accords and the Artemis Partnership are getting more partners, and the Chinese partnership and the International, let's see if I can figure out this acronym, International Lunar Research Station, ISL. I'm so bad at acronyms. ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, that's Chinese led, is also gaining new partners. And I want to discuss the differences between those partnerships and the differences between those two architectures so we can really understand what's happening on two sides of the globe here. It's really not a continuation necessarily of the US versus the Soviet Union back during the Cold War, but it is very interesting in that it sort of echoes it or mirrors it with different players. So first off, this is also a question and answer session. These live streams are really meant to be a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you want to put in the chat, or if you're watching this later, put in the comments, go ahead. I will answer them. I had a couple of questions that were submitted by a viewer, and so I will answer those at the end, and I will try to answer your questions as well. Anywhere you want to put them, on the comments or through social media or sending me a direct message. All right, getting into this. So some of you may be completely unfamiliar with the Chinese plans to return to the moon. I keep saying return. That's because I'm used to it from an American point of view, return to the moon. The Chinese plans to go to the moon with people and set up a base there. And that base is called the International Lunar Research Station. And that is something that is, I think, not well understood or discussed here in the United States, especially. If you hear it at all, you usually hear it from politicians who talk about how we need to fund NASA to counter that kind of activity in China. You'll see this narrative over and over again. We need to fund this satellite constellation or these technologies in space to counter what China's doing. And it's amazing. Actually, the discourse right now in the news is China's building a space plane similar to the X-37B, which is a Boeing-built Space Force-run space plane. And therefore, we need to be aware. Like, it's just so funny because the United States is doing the same things that China is doing, different ideologies for sure, like not even comparing the two ideologies. The government of China is completely different than the government of the United States and has its own set of atrocities that we won't get into. But when it comes to space activities, there's a lot of things that the United States is doing that China is also doing, and yet we see it as nefarious because China's space program is militarily run, and there's no separation between their exploration activities and their military activities. Whereas in the United States, they thought about this when they set up NASA. NASA is sort of a branch off from the NACA, and it was specifically created to be a civil space agency separate from the military. Now, there was a lot of overlap with the Air Force, and there still is a lot of overlap with the Air Force and Space Force, but I'm not getting into that here. So back to the ILRS. I will get this acronym right by the end of this live stream. I'm not good with acronyms. ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station. So the current timeline is that it's in its reconnaissance stage right now. That's the Chang'e missions. You might have heard some of those. Those are robotic missions. There was a lander. Chang'e 4, I think, was a rover. Pretty sure. Chang'e 6 and 7 and 8, and I actually don't know how many are planned, but they are planned out through about 2025 is that reconnaissance phase. That's at least the latest information that we have here in the Western. Maybe I do not read any language. Any language that is from China. I don't read Mandarin, so I have no idea what they're writing over on the Chinese news. But I do follow some really good Chinese journalists, like I shouldn't say Chinese journalists, space journalists that cover China. And they write in English, and I will link to them in the show notes after this live stream so that you can get an idea of what's going on over there. It's a lot of increased commercial activity because China's really trying to compete with the US space economy, especially SpaceX. And so they're really trying to bolster their commercial sector, and that's in quotes because is it really commercial, but that's a separate topic. So any case, the reconnaissance section of this, the phase, I should say phase, the reconnaissance phase of this station is going on right now. In addition to the Chang'e missions, there's also the Russian Luna missions. You might remember that name because the Luna missions have been going on since, I think, the 60s. Someone who's more historically accurate can tell me if that's right. But the most latest Luna mission actually crash landed earlier this year, did not succeed. And so Russia wants to do that. Roscosmos is the Russian space agency. They want to do another Luna mission in the future. I think they're saying 2026. However, Russia's really suffering right now from war, sanctions, other priorities, a corrupt government, lack of funding that actually goes towards space missions and not just in the pockets of people who are corrupt, lack of workforce because they're not paying their workforce well, and the older people who have actually built Roscosmos to what it is today, or what it was in its heyday, are retiring or deceased. And so I don't know how it's going to pan out for any kind of Russian space activity, human or otherwise, but they do have plans to launch another Luna mission at some point, 2025, 2026. I can't remember exactly when. The construction phase of the project is 2026 to 2035. That's when they actually want to start building this space station, this base on the surface of the moon. And they do not know, at least it has not been announced or I haven't read, where they're going to build it. And my guess is that's what the reconnaissance stage is for, to decide where and what that's going to look like. And then the utilization phase after 2026, approximately. So that's when they're actually going to land humans and have them on the surface of the moon. And I'm going to get to comparing and contrasting the architecture for Artemis in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to talk about the partnership. The countries involved are Uzbekistan, Belarus, China, of course, it's Chinese-led, Egypt, Pakistan, Russia. And now Russia, despite its long history, is definitely a second key player here. It's a founding partner with China, but definitely the junior partner. South Africa and Venezuela. With on December 6th, what was that, like a week and a half ago, Egypt recently was the most recent country to sign on, the Egyptian Space Agency. So you might have noticed from that list, there's not a whole lot of really good space players there. So there's China, and there is Russia. And Russia, I just went into how Russia's space program is in decline right now. And China is on the rise. So China, it is Chinese-led, and China is really the only country here that is sorry, I'm trying to like multitask with reading the chat. Thanks, Darsh. That is trying to do things on its own. So even though it has a lot of, let's say, junior players or non-traditional space players, I think China is going to go gung-ho on this regardless of who's involved. Of course, they'd probably like more countries that have experience with space, especially human spaceflight, because that's really difficult. But regardless what happens, I mean, China, I think, would go it alone if it had to. China is definitely committed to this mission, to sending humans out. They have their Tiangong space station, so they have experience already with human spaceflight, and they have their Chang'e missions on the moon, the uncrewed missions. And so I think they're really committed to doing this. Now, I did want to mention also involved in this are some organizations and companies that they're not, state governments, but they represent other countries. For example, Croatia, I'm not going to name all of these, but Croatia, Asia Pacific Space Cooperation, a company in Switzerland, or university in the UAE, a university in Thailand, and interestingly, the International Lunar Observatory Association in Hawaii. So even a U.S. organization is involved in this Chinese project. Now, there is a part of U.S. law called the Wolf Amendment put in place, I think, a bit over a decade ago, that was put in there because for a number of reasons I shouldn't get into it on this live stream. But in any case, there's a wall between what the United States is allowed to do with China, what a U.S. government is allowed to do with the Chinese government when it comes to space exploration. And there needs to be exceptions made, not only by the State Department, but also by the FBI for any cooperation between the Chinese government and the U.S. government. The U.S. did actually just get an exemption for U.S. Universities or researchers to apply to use samples or request samples from the Chinese missions that brought back samples from the moon. I don't remember which Chang'e mission that was. Maybe it was the latest one. Somebody can tell me in the comments. And so there was actually an exemption recently made. And I know that China has recently, a couple of years ago, used one of NASA's orbiters, I think the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So that exception was made. So it's not a complete blockade, but it is, in essence, a very, very difficult means of cooperating with China. But that I don't think applies directly to universities and to companies. There's ITAR restrictions when it comes to companies and universities. But universities, I think, because they're research oriented, I think they're more open to working with China and Chinese researchers. So we do have a Hawaiian organization on this list. Now, moving on to the U.S. architecture. Last live stream, last Friday, I went into the fact that I don't like the current architecture of Artemis, especially the gateway. I think it's pretty useless. I'm not going to go into that in detail here. You can watch the live stream from last week. But I do want to talk about how we are taking a different approach here in the United States, where instead of directly working on a lunar base, we are instead building a space station, a small space station, around in a strange orbit around the moon. And then later, we're going to be focusing on Artemis Base Camp. The Gateway was sort of a compromise. It was before Artemis was even called Artemis. It was sort of a flexibility thing of what if the new Biden administration cancels it, like every other administration cancels the previous ones. And so we need to have some kind of flexible architecture that is non-controversial-ish. I mean, it still is kind of controversial, but like it's not going to be canceled like Constellation was canceled, like the asteroid redirect mission was canceled. And so there just wanted to be a continuity between the two administrations. And it turned out that the Biden administration did not cancel Artemis, so all for naught. But in any case, it's also an international partnership. And I have argued for the past probably year and a half that Gateway should have been not in existence and had all of that strong international partnership directed toward Artemis Base Camp, because now Gateway is very, very hard to cancel because there's so much international partnership. And there's also hardware that's actually been developed, not launched yet. Nothing's been launched yet, but there's actual hardware that is preparing for launch. And imagine if that had been a base camp instead of a lunar gateway small space station outpost. But I digress. So involved in Lunar Gateway is, of course, NASA. It is the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, and the Japanese Aeronautic Exploration Agency. So you might recognize those names. That's every single current partner of the ISS except for Russia. So basically, the ISS has its very strong partnerships. The ISS has been around for 25 years, and it has developed really strong international partnerships between all of those organizations I just mentioned, plus Roscosmos. Roscosmos has not been the best partner over the past several years when it comes to the ISS. And so with Roscosmos deciding to side itself now with China's plans, and Russia claims they're going to do their own space station. That's not happening. But they have plans, they say, to do their own space station. They've decided not to join the Gateway Partnership. So that Gateway Partnership is strong in terms of the organizations that have previous space experience. There are some countries that are missing from this partnership here. The Artemis Accords, which is a long list, it's 33 countries. I'm not going to name them all, but I do want to mention some of the countries that I did not just mention as part of that partnership that are part of the Artemis Accords. So, for example, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, Mexico. I mean, Mexico is not exactly a strong space, faring nation, but some of those other countries there, they are really good international partners for the United States that don't have a place on Gateway yet, or don't have a place like firm plans for the Artemis program yet, with some exceptions here. I also want to mention India. So let me talk about India first. India did sign the Artemis Accords in June, which was actually kind of a shock to a lot of people, including myself, because I personally expected India to remain sort of neutral. It doesn't necessarily want to align itself with China's plans. It doesn't necessarily want to align itself with the US plans, at least I thought. But it turns out maybe it does want to align itself with the US plans, because India not only signed the Artemis Accords in June, it recently announced that it is partnering with NASA to train some of its Indian astronauts to fly on the ISS as soon as next year. India is working on building its own space station. So they declined to partner with the International Space Station. They're working on their own space station, which has been delayed. I don't know what the current date is off the top of my head, but they do want to actually partner with NASA to train their astronauts before they build their own space station. And so I think that is an indicator. I'm not an expert in India, but I think that's an indicator that maybe we should expect to see India participate in the Artemis program, perhaps on Gateway, perhaps in another way. Australia is a fun one. Australia doesn't have a role on Gateway yet. Here's me losing my voice. But the Australian Space Agency is planning a small rover that they are going to send to the moon on one of the Artemis missions. And they just had a naming contest, and they named that rover Rover, just adorable. And so they already have plans that'll fly as soon as 2026. If they already have plans to participate in that method of exploration through Artemis, then I can imagine they're going to have other means of participating in Artemis in the future. So even though that Gateway partnership is currently limited right now to the ISS partners minus Russia, I can expect a lot more strong spacefaring nations to participate in the Artemis program going on. So what we have here is we have U.S. leadership around a really good collection of countries that have space history, space exploration experience, and then some new players too. Like I mentioned last week, Angola is the most recent signatory of the Artemis Accords. And then you have China. And China's only partner here is that has a strong space experience is Russia, and Russia is not doing well right now. And so what does that mean for the Chinese partnership? I think it just means that they, like I said earlier, they're committed to going no matter what. And it just might be a harder route for them to go with some partners that don't have that traditional experience. But on the other hand, there are actually some partners that are doing both. So there are some countries that are participating, for example, in the Tiangong space station, as well as the International Space Station. And so I don't think that it's such a dichotomy there. It's really not like the Soviet Union, where you had the Soviet Union countries and you had the US and the Western Allied countries, and there was that really hard separation. Again, I'm not a historian, so I might be getting slightly wrong, but I don't see that happening here. I think it's more gray. I think you've got a strong base here, and then you've got some gray throughout the rest of the world, where there's definitely some strong Western allies, there's definitely some strong Chinese allies, but a lot of the world is just open to wanting to go to space, like wanting to participate in the new space economy, the new space exploration. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see. And who knows how that's going to play out in the future. There are some alternative histories and science fiction that have sort of China and the United States working together in the future. I don't know how that's going to turn out. Like, I would love a Star Trek Federation future where we're just Earth, but realistically, I don't see that happening anytime soon. I do want to talk about Artemis Base Camp. Since I've been focusing on Gateway, Artemis Base Camp is not firmly established. There are no details that are settled yet. Even as early as this year, I think April, there was a announcement or an interview given by Jim Free, who, let me see his title, the Associate Administrator for Exploration Systems Development at NASA. And Jim Free said that Artemis Base Camp might not just be one camp, it might be several smaller camps, to be determined, and that it'll probably be Artemis 7 or later. So we are actually looking at the 2030s. So maybe even that same time frame as China. I honestly thought maybe 5 years ago that no problem, the United States would get back to the moon before China goes the first time. However, with people. However, we've been going so slow with Artemis that I really don't know. When people talk about this being a space race, I point to the fact that there's no urgency here in the United States. If this was truly a space race, if this was truly a global competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, you see that urgency back, not just with the resources, but with that motivation and that dedication to that mission. There's not that same urgency here. I was not alive, obviously, during the Cold War, but I do not see any kind of urgency here in the United States, or even awareness by the rest of the country that we are going to the moon, that we need to beat China to the moon. So honest to God, I do not think we're in a space race, because I don't see any evidence that we are racing anywhere with the Artemis program. I do want to mention here that this is a channel that is brought to you for free, and I would truly, really appreciate it if you subscribe. That's all I'm asking for you, is just to subscribe to the channel. I really do appreciate it. I am trying to get the word out there, and so by you subscribing, it actually makes a difference. And also, this is a question and answer session, so please post your questions. I want to get to SDub300, or maybe Stub300, who asks, how is the equipment protected from space radiation and other harmful particles? How harmful are muons? So first off, there's a lot of work that's been done over the entire course of space history here, all the way back to, I don't know, probably the 40s or the 50s, before we ever flew humans, that we knew that we needed to protect against the radiation of space. We've got gamma rays, cosmic galactic rays, ionizing radiation. We can just stand out into the sun too long. We know that the sun is harmful to human bodies. You don't want to get that that sunburn. And so what we do is we actually have hydrogen-rich materials. That's what the ISS uses. It uses polyethylene to protect against the radiation that would be harmful to human bodies. Kevlar, I know, has been used in the past. I don't know if Kevlar is being used currently. And one benefit to the ISS being in low Earth orbit is actually atmospheric protection from the Earth's atmosphere. Even though the ISS is in space, there's no clear delineation between space and atmosphere. So there's still atmospheric particles that the ISS is hitting all the time. And that's why the ISS needs to be occasionally reboosted to a higher orbit, because those particles create drag. And all this to say, those particles are surrounding the ISS, even though the ISS is in space. It is most definitely in space. It's up there in low Earth orbit, but it still has those atmospheric particles that protect it from the radiation. I myself have been guilty in the past of saying that Earth's magnetic field protects the ISS from radiation, but it's actually the magnetosphere actually protects the atmosphere of Earth, and the atmosphere of Earth protects us from radiation. Now, Gateway and all the other deeper space exploration that we're going to do to Mars, for example, is going to be very vulnerable, because there's not going to be that Earth's atmosphere to protect them. And I could not get a straight answer. I don't know if this is publicly out there of what kind of radiation protection Gateway is going to use, or SpaceX Starship HLS, or Blue Moon HLS. I just don't know. It's not out there. So if someone has that information, I'd love to know. Or maybe I just couldn't find it. Maybe it's out there and I couldn't find it. I do know that there's testing right now of what that radiation environment looks like. There's also testing being done by a company called Astrorad, which uses proprietary plastic made of hydrocarbon polymers. And so if I find out any more information about that, I will let you know. Also, muons. So I'm a physicist, but I'm not a particle physicist, which means that my knowledge of particle physics is actually minuscule. I actually did not focus my physics education on particle physics hardly at all. And so I don't know a whole lot about muons, other than the fact that according to ESA, at sea level, the flow of muons is about 170 muons per square meter per second. So humans are crossed by 30 muons per second. So that tells me that muons probably are not harmful to us at all. So thank you for your question. I'm curious to know why you brought up muons in particular. Cool stuff. Particle physics is awesome stuff. It's not something that I ever really studied, but it is really, really amazing. I went the opposite direction. I studied gamma ray bursts. So if we're around a gamma ray burst, we're dead. The entire planet is dead. So that's the direction I went in with my studies. If you have any questions, please submit them here in the chat or in the comments. I'm not going to be live streaming next week because of Christmas. So if you celebrate, have a wonderful Christmas to you. I will be back the week after. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Darsh.